This is more like it. No one orders me around. At last. Finally.
Welcome
Wait
to
till
our
you see
village.
me in action.
Tread lightly.
Hello.
What is it now?
Give me something
Speak,
to do.
fool. Finally.
Greetings, my lord.
Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Tread lightly. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. What is it now? I was a fool to trust in the light. The Lich King has given me true power. I'll be twice the king my father ever was. Lordaeron will be reborn. Who is this darkness, anyway? No one orders me around. No one orders me around. What is it now? At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. At last. What is it now? This is more like it. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Finally. Now, Frostmourne. You will know endless torment. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. What is it now? At last. Finally. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Finally. This is more like it. What is it? Frostmourne hungers. At last. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Last. For the Lich King, Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our resident town is under attack.
What is it now? No one orders me around. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Your pain shall be felt. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
First blood.
At last. Finally. What is it? Oh, jeez. This is more like it. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Glory to the scourge. Now, Frostmourne. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Your pain shall be legendary. Frostmourne hungers. This Speak, fool. What is it now? Tread lightly. What is it now? Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. No one is moving around. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Our forces are under attack.
This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Our brethren's town is
This
under
is
attack.
Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. What is it? At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. last. Finally. Speak, fool. What is it now? At last. This is more like it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
No one orders me around. At last. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. What is it? Speak, fool. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool.
Our brethren's town is
What
under
is it
attack.
now? Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. This is more like it. No one orders me. Finally. What is it? At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Finally.
Our
This is
brethren's
more
town is under attack.
What is it now? Tread lightly.
You will end this. Your pain shall end.
Last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Finally. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn
Our
hungers.
brethren's town
This
is
more
under
like
attack.
it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Finally. Speak, fool. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? At last. Finally. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. At last.
Wicked sick.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it.
Our brethren's
This
town
is
is
more
under
like
attack.
it. At last. No one orders me around. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Finally.
is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? At last. Finally. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Are under attack.
This is more like it. This is more like it. For the Lich King. At last, Frostborn hungers.
Our forces are under attack.
Speak, fool. At last.
Faithless coward. You will end this war.
This is what Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly.
I'll make sure you see.
This is more like it. At last.
You will end this war.
At last.
Double kill.
This is
Dominating. Double kill. Killing spree. Double kill. Mega kill. Triple kill.
No one's around. This is more like it. Tread lightly.
Our reverend's town is under
What is it
attack.
now? Speak, fool. No one orders me around. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
Our reverend's town
This
is under
more like
attack.
it. At last. Speak, fool. Finally. No one orders me around. What is it now? This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it.
Welcome to our room.
I'll have it up in no time.
Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
You're interrupting my calculations.
Finally.
Your pain shall be lit.
At last. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. What is it now? What is it now? At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Glory to the Scourge. You will know
At last, finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool, is my aid required. No one orders me around. At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Tread lightly. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. Finally. At last. This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. At last. Frostborn At last. This is At last.
Our brother's town is under attack.
Frostborn is more like it. At last. Tread
Greetings, Mario.
No, not
Speak,
like that.
fool. This
Let me
is
do
more
it.
like it. No one orders me around. What ails you? What is it now?
What do you want?
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is what you will be endless for the Lich King. Frostmourne hungers. Figures coming. At last. At last.
Our brethren's tower is under attack.
This is
Wicked sin.
at last. Frostmourne. Frostmourne.
Our brethren's tower is under attack.
At last. This is Frostmourne hunger. This is more like at last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like finally.
Insufficient
This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Faithless coward. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like Frostmourne
Unstoppable. Triple kill.
You're interrupting my calculations.
tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. At last. For the Lich King. This is more like it.
My life for this.
Speak, fool. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. No one knows.
Our forces are under attack.
Speak. This is more like it. What is it now? Tread lightly. No one orders me around. At last, Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our forces are
Frostmourne
under attack.
hungers. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. You will end. Last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Dominate.
At last. Speak. Frostmourne hungers. You will know endless throne. This is more like it. At last. last. At last.